Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNCKnowledge. Twitter.com/UNCKnowledge. Ask questions, send comments, suggest guests. Today's guest, Harvey C. Mansfield Jr., matriculated at Harvard in 1949 and has been there ever since. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1953, and his doctorate from Harvard in 1961. In 1962, he joined the Harvard faculty, and today Professor Mansfield is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard. The author of translations and studies of political philosophers from Aristotle to Burke to Machiavelli to Tocqueville, Professor Mansfield is the author of more than a dozen books, including America's Constitutional Soul, The Controversial Manliness, and just out, Tocqueville in a size that anybody can take. A very short introduction to Tocqueville. Today on Uncommon Knowledge, one of the most distinguished academics in America on the state of the American Academy. Harvey, let me begin by noting that when you were asked not long ago to name your proudest achievement, you replied, and I quote you, "At a certain point in my career at Harvard, I decided to raise a little hell." Close quote. Would you care to explain yourself?
Oh, well.
The raising of hell is your proudest
achievement.
achievement.
Raising hell, I decided to have a little fun. Most professors who have tenure are very security conscious. That's a strange thing. You would think that somebody who has lifetime tenure would be willing to take a few adventures.
Whoop it up a little.
Yeah, but they don't. I think it seems that when you have security, you become even more obsessed about security. It isn't that it sets you free. So I decided to make use of my tenure.
All right,
and
good.
to do that by raising hell.
All right, let's raise a little hell together right now. Segment 1, leanings. Few statistics. Political contributions by the faculties of several Ivy League institutions during the presidential election year of 2008. Harvard, 7% to Republican candidates, 93% to Democrats. Yale, 6% to Republicans, 94% to Democrats. My own beloved Dartmouth, apparently a bastion of conservatism, with 14% to Republicans and a mere 86% to Democrats. Harvey, why is this? Why are the faculty at so many impressive institutions so monolithically to the left?
They can't help it. Because they see each other and live with each other and listen to each other and talk to each other. And they all turned left in this way in the late 60s. So
you saw it happen. You were on the faculty
I saw it happen.
Right.
That's when it took place. In the late 60s, the New Left took over from liberalism. The New Left's main enemy was not conservatism. There weren't many conservatives at that time. Harvard was run by liberals of an older kind. Cold War liberals, a lot of them. And
that would have been when you entered Harvard, the faculty would have been dominated by, I'm trying to adjust a Cold War liberal would have been John Kennedy.
That's right.
Willing to endorse the New Deal.
People like that, yeah.
But proud of the United States, a sense of national morale, willing to deploy American force abroad. That would have been the Harvard faculty in those days.
All of them hard graders.
We'll come to that.
Yeah.
All right.
So, yes, what happened then? Was there. Well, at that time, they were simply taken over by the young. Some of them fought, and I fought with them. I was younger. But most of them succumbed to the siren call of the New Left, which placed the protesting youth in charge of the university. They were taking over from the establishment the various institutions which had gotten us into the Vietnam War, and even more were misapplying authority and in general stultifying the country. That was what their view was, and that all of us were undemocratic because we graded people and because we had standards, and we thought that some people were smarter than others. They came after us, and they invaded classrooms and interrupted public discussions and pushed everybody in the universities to the left. What I saw then was just how weak liberalism was in its
because there was no fight in it.
Center. There was no fight. No longer was a liberal somebody who stood up for something and stood up in defense of liberty, but it was a person who was also eager to please and also afraid of being criticized by those younger than him. At that time, you could say the youth and the students took over the university. That's receded somewhat. They no longer run the place. And yet, in a way, they do, because they are...
they have tenure.
Yeah, they don't have tenure, but yes, you're right. As professors, they now have tenure.
Right.
Yeah. The students come and go still, but they're very much very politicized and very much to the left.
Now you say
so. All this begins, I think, from the students.
I see.
And the faculty's surrender to the students.
Segment 2, Western Civilization. Historian Gilbert Allardyce, quote, "For a time between the First World War and the campus protests of the 60s, all roads led to the Western Civ class. Classrooms filled, teachers multiplied, in the discussion sections, generations of teaching assistants began their apprenticeship in college instruction. Then came the collapse. As Stanford, where we're taping this program, was considering its curriculum in the 1980s, Jesse Jackson led hundreds of students in chanting, 'Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go.' The historian Victor Davis Hanson tells of giving a lecture about the history of the West and realizing about halfway through that most of the students expected him to talk about cowboys. That was what the West meant to them. Western civilization, great books, Athens and Jerusalem, gone. What happened?"
Yes, I was going to add great books to your mentioning of the Western Civ. Yes, those have gone. Those books make us think, and that kind of history presents us with the problems of our civilization. Western civilization is not one thing. It's, in a way, divided against itself in a very interesting way. The most important, perhaps, between church and state, between theology and philosophy. And so Western civilization is not a civilization which has one answer, one authoritative answer to everything, but it contains within itself problems and questions. So it's much more interesting and also more powerful than other non-Western civilizations, and we've seen that they've gradually watched Western civilization cover the globe and come to them and force them to make concessions to it. So Western civilization is something which is full of interest and full of questions.
And so one of the aspects of this I've always found puzzling is, just as you say, to study Western, so they're great books if you start with Homer and include the Hebrew scriptures and work your way through. It's not always a pretty picture, and moreover, the self-critique begins from the very beginning. Homer is filled with what we have to believe are intentionally morally ambiguous moments.
Surely.
You have the prophets in the Old Testament attacking the kings. Yeah. And so the openness of the civilization itself to protest from within, it's almost as though there's a very shallow notion that to study Western civilization is to come adoring in a simple-minded way to our own history, which is not the case at all.
That's right. As if it were all a canon enforced by some sacred authority. That's certainly not true. No.
You've written an essay back when Harvard was reconsidering its core curriculum in the 90s. You wrote an essay in which you made a number of specific recommendations. And alas, we don't have time to go all the way through your essay right now. But I'd like to, if you could give me a few sentences on each of these. You've got Western civilization is a recommendation you made for the Harvard curriculum. Quote, "A course that begins with Homer and ends somewhere in the vicinity of Nietzsche still makes a lot of sense." Why does it still make sense?
Those are, if you go through Homer to Nietzsche, mentioning, say, a dozen names, those would give you, and you read those books, those would give you the main alternatives behind our way of life today. And so in that way, it would be extremely relevant. Relevance was a demand of the late 60s, but they didn't ever get to it because they were afraid of permanence. What those great books and what Western civilization courses do is open you to the permanent problems of mankind and of human nature. The questions that return again and again. What is the good life? Is it a good thing to be ambitious? Or is it, in general, a bad and selfish thing to do?
By the time undergraduates matriculate at Harvard, that one's already been answered. Religion, quote, religion should not only be present but central in our curriculum.
Well, it's central in the lives of billions and billions of people, and it's also a central question in our society and again in our Western history. So do we live under God, or are we left to our own devices to do what we wish or what we think right? What is the need for authority? What kind of God exists if there is a God? All these are the absolutely central questions, and we see it even in our time or in our age of science. Science cannot defend itself. Science doesn't have answers to the big questions that religion faces and attempts to answer.
The military, quote, this is hardly taught at all, close quote.
It's amazing. For example, in my department, political scientists, a lot of them study civic engagement, the lack of civic engagement. Our society is too individualistic, too selfish. How do we get together? It never occurs to them that a person who volunteers to serve in the military is engaged in civic engagement. They think that it's all a matter of, well, to cite President Obama, community organizing. Right. You know, getting people together or holding hands while we pretend to tolerate each other.
America, quote, far too little is taught about America at Harvard.
We're much too apologetic about America. We are embarrassed that America is as powerful and as prominent as it seems to be, and there's a considerable doubt that we deserve to be in that place. Well, all right, let's look at the facts. How did we get to where we are? That would be one big question that undergraduate students ought to consider when it's their own country involved.
Segment 3, Harvey C for C-, Mansfield. I'm told by some of your former students that you earned that nickname. A statistic and a quotation. Here's the statistic. In 1950, about 1/6 of the students in any given course at Harvard received a grade of B+ or higher, a sixth. By 2007, more than half received A- or higher. Here's the quotation, Harvey Mansfield, quote, there is something inappropriate, almost sick, in the spectacle of mature adults showering young people with unbelievable praise, close quote. Sick? Explain yourself.
It's passing strange. That's a kind of sick. That professors who devoted their lives to their field should be so quick to find excellence in so many students. It just doesn't make sense that 50% of a Harvard class can receive an A or A-, and yet that's what our average is. That's what our average is.
Now, you have famously introduced your own antidote to grade inflation. Would you explain to us how ironic grading works?
Well, I decided to give my students 2 grades. One is the one that it goes to the registrar. That's the ironic grade, and that's based on the Harvard average. And the other one is a private grade from me to them, telling them what they really deserve. And this it's a way of showing my contempt for the grade inflation that we have at Harvard now, and is not just at Harvard, obviously, but all American universities. And on the other hand, not punishing my own students for taking my course.
I've talked to a number of your former students, and it's the grade that comes from you that matters to them. They do appreciate it. Now, how many professors at Harvard have followed your example, giving real grades, even if only privately?
I don't know. I haven't heard of any.
You are not aware of any?
Yeah, not aware of any.
Here's another way of getting at the same kind of question. In 2004, Princeton decided to end grade inflation. Just did it.
Yeah.
And they imposed a rule that in no department could more than 35% of the students who took a course in that department receive A's. So they just enforced a university-wide curve. At Dartmouth, they've addressed the problem by printing not only the student's grade, but the median grade in the course on the transcript. So
right.
An A in a course where the median is A is less impressive than an A in a course where the median is B minus.
Right.
As far as I know, Princeton, which just ended it, Dartmouth, which is struggling with it,
yeah.
Out of 8 Ivy League institutions, those are the only 2 to take action. What is going on? Why should it be? Explain to me the psychology behind this collapse of grading standards.
It becomes routine to give everybody high grades.
It's just laziness because it's so easy?
It becomes laziness. It starts off as a point of view namely that, and this again from the late 60s, that it's oppression for a professor to be in the position of a grader, of passing judgment on the young. We should listen to them, not instruct them, or in any way command them. But that principle is not really held any longer. It's just that it has fallen into a routine in which it is easy for professors to give high grades because students don't complain. The students like it, the parents like it, the administrators of the universities like it because the students don't make a fuss, and the rest, employers afterwards, or graduate schools just have to shift with it.
Segment 4, gender, or the absence thereof. Harvey Mansfield, quote, this actually, as a parent who's writing big checks to a child in college, and this is the one that brings tears to your eyes. Harvey Mansfield, quote, together the feminists and the left make up perhaps half the faculty, the other half being moderate liberals who are afraid of the feminists rather than with them, close quote. Let's unpack that to begin with. Distinguish the feminists from the left.
Well, those are almost all women, obviously, and they are on the left, but they always insist on raising the question of affirmative action or of having more women, and always having more women means having more women of their kind. It doesn't mean having more conservative women or having a diversity or a variety of points of view among women. No, so their concentration is always on the woman's question, and this isn't always so with those who are more generally on the left.
All right. Now, this question you've just touched on, this question of diversity. Diversity is the word that gets used over and over again, and you have made the point that on the government department, there are roughly 50 professors,
yeah.
And you have said about 3 conservatives.
Yes.
So I put to you what you already know, which is that if there were 50 professors and only 3 women, Harvard University would be all over that in a moment. If there were 50 professors and only 3 persons of color, the university would be all over that because Harvard University cares about ethnic and gender diversity. Mm-hmm. But 50 professors and only 3 conservatives, shrug.
Yeah.
Why doesn't the university, of course Harvard is the example we're using, but what we're saying is true of university after university, why shouldn't it care most about intellectual diversity?
Well, of course it should, but it doesn't. These people all of a sudden go moral and saying, oh, you mustn't force us to make appointments on the basis of politics. So we only choose whoever is best. And if it just turns out that you've got 47 liberals and 3 conservatives, well, that is funny, but it's not really objectionable. And it isn't as if you conservatives really suffer. You're being conservative, you probably have more money than the rest of us.
Well, I'll quote you again, Harvey. Quote, in my time, I think by my time you're talking about your student or early days on the faculty, women expected to be happy in life without having a career. Women are now as ambitious as men. Having a career has become their duty. How strange that the women's movement, inspired by sometime Marxists like Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan, has brought about a great increase in bourgeois careerism among young women. So instead of empowering women as women, the feminist movement has instructed them to act like men. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. That's exactly what its effect has been.
Would I get an honest A for that question?
Yes, you would.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. And it shows up in matters of sex, too. As if feminism understands equality as sexual equality, and sexual equality means that women should be as free to be as great predators as the worst of men. And so they look on a sexual license and having fun in that rather advanced way as a matter of political principle.
All right, from women to men, manliness, your 2006 controversial book. Yeah. As feminism in the academy has risen, what has happened to manliness?
Well, it's under a cloud of suspicion, to put it mildly. I don't think that manliness is ever in danger of disappearing. It's part of human nature, and that, I think, is where I mainly differ from the feminists. So it isn't that it's gone or disappeared, it's just that it's no longer employed. It no longer is regarded. That's right. It's that's right. Somehow that is on the side. Yeah. Right. And that's an exception, which is strangely made
to please the alumni, right?
To please the alumni and a few of the more rowdy males.
I'll quote you again, Harvey. Today we live in a gender-neutral society. It's a society in which your sex matters as little as possible. It doesn't give you your rights or your duties, and certainly not your place. This is new. It hasn't been done before in human history. The gender-neutral society is really a kind of experiment. How's the experiment coming out?
Well, it's hard to know because it doesn't regard itself as an experiment. It regards itself as a perfectly natural development out of democracy. That democracy has a tendency to become more and more democratic, as Tocqueville remarked, and this is just another instance among many that could be cited to make that point. And so they don't think of this as doing something strange, although they are certainly conscious that no other society that they can name has ever been gender neutral before, and it's there are only 1 or 2 possible feminist utopias in which such societies have been conceived.
Segment 5, speech. Quoting you again, Harvey. Sensitivity is today's version of the soft despotism that Alexis de Tocqueville worried about in democracies, and it would not have surprised him that the worst of it would be found in the halls of the intellect. Let's take that one step by step. What did Tocqueville mean by soft despotism?
It's democratic despotism. It's a despotism which arises from the dangerous individuality, or what he calls individualism, in modern democracy. That's when people decide that they can't do anything on their own with other people, that they are the victim of huge historical forces that are mindless and extremely powerful, And so they react by returning to their own private lives, their family, their friends, and themselves, and let government run their politics for them. Mm. So it's a kind of despotism that results sort of automatically without being intended by anybody, and works through benevolent measures. Big government, or the immense being of government that Tocqueville refers to, is perfectly good, well-intentioned, mm-hmm. and doesn't mean to lord it over you, but it just ends up doing that, mostly because people decide to allow it to do that.
How is it that sensitivity has now become a form of soft despotism?
Well, sensitivity is letting other people's reactions to you decide your behavior. So instead of choosing to do what you think is right and then defending it, you say something or try out something or listen to other people demand something and try to adapt to that.
So
instead of,
when the students chant, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go, and the professoriate, which has dedicated its life to Western civilization, says, if it has to go, it has to go.
Yeah.
That's sensitivity.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, why is it that de Tocqueville wouldn't have been surprised to find the worst of it in the halls of the intellect?
Because it is something that begins as an intellectual proposition. The proposition that we don't really run our own lives, but we are victims or puppets of large historical forces beyond our control.
Mm. I'll quote you again. Being sensitive to blacks and women, we're talking about life on campus now, gave them the right to be offended when they pleased, and they were encouraged to react with indignation whenever they felt put upon. Thus, the notion of sensitivity led to less toleration rather than more. Those not tolerated were, of course, conservatives. Close quote.
Yeah.
Less toleration rather than more.
Well, because it's you start off by demanding toleration, and then understand toleration as agreeing with you, or making you feel welcome, or making you feel making you feel that you agree, or that you're in agreement, the two of you. So it becomes a demand that the person who's tolerating actually take measures to prevent the other fellow from the victim from feeling bad.
And this led to the proliferation of speech codes on campuses in the 90s and early 2000s, where the notion was you shouldn't say anything that would make anyone else feel uncomfortable. How do you know it would make them feel uncomfortable? They say they're uncomfortable.
Yes. And
so it submerges the standard into purely subjective.
Yeah, and encourages people to say, I feel uncomfortable.
Right, because that's a way of grasping power.
They pick out certain things to say. Now, for example, black students. I was once accused of saying, you people. Well, that's a phrase which is sometimes used, I suppose, to refer disparagingly to a group of blacks. But you people. So they pick on what they take to be sort of signals in other people's speech, and interpret it as malign, a kind of malevolence on the part of the speaker.
Right. And so what, in the second half of that quotation, what I find so striking is that, of course, those not tolerated were, of course, conservatives. We hear over and over and over again that the reason there are more people to the left in faculty than conservatives is that, well, that's just not the kind of life that attracts conservatives. They'd rather go make money on Wall Street, or they'd rather go into the military. Probably not very many liberals in the military, are there? So it's just the way human beings sort themselves out. And in this, of course, you're saying not a bit of it. There is an active animus against conservatives on campus. Is that correct?
Yes. The people who put toleration first are intolerant of those who don't put toleration first. If you have any kind of principle, or try to live by any kind of principle, then toleration is not the most important thing in your life. But by persuasion, or doing the right thing and persuading other people to agree with you, or at least to tolerate you. But the liberals have often, or typically, taken choice and a demand for toleration of infinite choice as their principle, when in fact the difficulty is which choice should you make?
They'll tell you, Harvey.
Which principles should you use by which to...
One final time, let me quote you to yourself. And I have to say, this is just outrageous for you to say this, Harvey, the way you do. Conservatism is closer to the mission of the university than liberalism is. Conservatives are more tolerant than liberals, close quote. Now, I've asked you to explain yourself a number of times. This is one case in which I'd ask you to defend yourself.
Yes, conservatives are more tolerant because conservatives don't expect that liberalism is going to disappear, whereas liberals expect that conservatism will disappear. And that's because they think that conservatism is based on superstition or prejudice, something that isn't necessary to human life, and that can easily be dispensed with. So there's no excuse, therefore, for a conservative to remain conservative. Once he's enlightened, once he's seen the truth, then he'll abandon his view. But conservatives, I think, don't have that illusion. They know that there will always be the left.
Right.
And that it will come back in one form or another, and that our politics consists of a kind of alternation between left and right. And they're much more tolerant of people who disagree with them.
Conservatism is closer to the mission of the university.
Yeah, that's because the mission of the university should be to open minds and not to close them. It shouldn't declare that certain people are prejudiced and shouldn't be listened to and can be easily dismissed. That's the way of political correctness, and that's not the way of a proper university.
Professor Harvey Mansfield, a Harvard man since 1953?
1949.
1949, excuse me, since matriculating, not since graduating, since 1949. The author of countless books, including Manliness and Just Out, Tocqueville, which I actually am going to put this one in my pocket and give myself a refresher course in Tocqueville on my vacation this week. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
A pleasure. We'll have to reconvene and talk about Tocqueville next time. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.